You're listening to BreakPoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Today, we're going to talk about the dust-up at Spotify over the Joe Rogan podcast and what's being labeled misinformation. We're also going to talk about the role of capitalism in our society and what it means for Christians to live virtuously in that system. We have a lot to get to today, but we're so glad you're with us. Thanks for sticking around. Welcome to BreakPoint This Week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. John, I'm coming to you live from the center of the snowpocalypse. It's here. I can confirm.
The center of it. How much do you got?
Well, I was just telling Wayne this. We don't have a ton in terms of accumulation, but it's the first layer is all pure ice. So the roads are impossible at this point, especially in my neighborhood, which has brick streets and they can't plow it. But I think the better part of yesterday, we got all ice and sleet, and then it turned into snow on top of it. So it's
Is it still snowing as we speaketh?
It is. It is large, beautiful snowflakes. We feel like we're playing Little House on the Prairie today because we can't go out, and we also ran out of groceries at about just the right time. So we're just living primitively here. Do you feel bad for me?
Nope. Nope. We got a bunch too, but we don't get that ice, which is great. We get the big fluffy snowflakes.
That's so pretty. This happens, I think, like once a year usually. We get a big ice storm like this and what have you. It's like one of those, like, if you walk on the snow, you're not going to make a footprint because it's just ice, which is kind of cool. Okay, well, let's get into it. We have a lot to get to today. I wanted to start with, we talked about Joe Rogan last week, actually, on the show. We were talking about his interview with Jordan Peterson. But I wanted to talk about this situation with you this week because I feel like it's been everywhere in the news and social media. It's a big deal for a lot of people, understandably. So Spotify, there have been increased calls for Spotify to basically censor Joe Rogan's podcast. So Spotify hosts his podcast for a reportedly very large deal. I mean, there's a lot of money involved here. He has the most downloaded podcast in the world, I believe. And he's had a number of people on throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And his show is pretty much an interview format. He's had a number of people on who've had questions about the COVID pandemic. So people questioning lockdowns, vaccines, masking, that sort of thing. And as a result, there have been several letters. I was reading yesterday, there was a letter written by like 200 doctors and nurses asking Spotify to basically censor or take down his episodes about COVID-19. And then Neil Young, the musician, threatened to remove his music. He basically gave Spotify an ultimatum. You can either keep my music or keep Joe Rogan. And that was not a difficult decision for Spotify. And so Neil Young's music is no longer on Spotify. Other musicians have started saying the same thing. Joni Mitchell, I think, was one of them. It's just become a large debate. It was brought up actually at the White House press briefing, and Jen Psaki said that they believe Spotify should do more to combat what she called misinformation. And all of this language is so loaded. The term misinformation, even the White House press secretary saying Spotify should do more. I don't know what do more means. Joe Rogan has responded and said that he tries to have people on with differing perspectives. He basically posted like a 10-minute video to Instagram talking about the way he approaches his show. And I thought it was the temperature was low, which I appreciated. He didn't seem super angry or anything, but this has just sparked a really, really interesting debate. And I thought it was interesting for our purposes too, given that we are about to start a short course about authority and about trust in authority, what happens when that trust erodes, and what Christians' attitudes toward authority should be. That seems to be at the center of this situation here, which is what kind of authority is Joe Rogan, or should we expect from him? What kind of authority does the government or even Spotify have over his content? What authority should they have? There's so many questions here. Have you been following this story?
Yeah, let me just say too that Neil Young telling Spotify that it's either
I was trying to be nice about it,
or Joe Rogan is like. I was trying to figure out an analogy. It's like AC Green writing to the Lakers saying it's either LeBron or me.
Right.
In other words, the guy's been retired for a really long time. He was a good player, but not a great player. And, we're talking about the biggest player on the planet. It was an easy decision. And of course, the reason Joe Rogan was able to respond so calmly and actually cordially is that Spotify's clearly got his back. It's going to take an enormous amount of additional people. You have to add up an awful lot of Neil Youngs and Joni Mitchells to get to a Joe Rogan.
Well, and I should say too, just for context, Spotify did put out a statement, and it was the weirdest. They didn't mention Joe Rogan or anybody by name, but they said what they've decided to do is to put a content advisory on any episode of any podcast that mentions COVID-19, which means nothing. Now it's not a content advisory. It's just a little note that says this episode is about COVID-19. So that was a really interesting response, but I think telling as to what you're saying, that they have no choice. He's the biggest podcast in the world. They're not going to get rid of him.
And I think it's important to note that Rogan hasn't taken a personal stand, as I know, other than not being vaccinated himself. In his statement said that he would like to bring in people on both sides of that issue. And I think actually, given his interview format, that would actually be really, really helpful. A lot of the things that were labeled as misinformation yesterday, like, for example, cloth masks are pointless, are, reported on CNN as facts today. A set of studies came out this week from Johns Hopkins talking about the effectiveness of the lockdowns. And, you have that. And then you have, the New York Times podcast, just even this morning, talking about no COVID in China. In other words, here you have the headline that China has been touting and a run up to the Olympics, that there's no COVID there. And the New York Times talking about, what kind of incredible measures that they took. And if there's no COVID in China, there's one of two reasons. Number one is they're lying, which I think is probably true. Number two, their lockdown measures are so draconian and so restrictive of personal freedom, way beyond anything that was experienced in the United States, even in New York or California or Michigan. The harm done is that much greater. And probably the reason is both of those things. They're lying about no COVID and the measures were so over the top. So what got you labeled as misinformation and COVID is one of the things that now is the backdrop, I guess, of really what this whole thing points to. And it doesn't point to Joe Rogan. It doesn't point to COVID. It doesn't point to Fauci. It doesn't point to any of that. It points to a culture that has a crisis of authority and a loss of trust. It is a systemic, culture-wide issue. There's no way around it. There's many, many reasons for it too, by the way, Maria. Right. And I think it's worth walking through all of them because all of them have uniquely contributed kind of in a timeline to a place where we just don't know who to trust anymore. And so now we've become cynical anytime we're asked to trust, which isn't a good response either. And it's not healthy. It's not sustainable. That's kind of the context that, this story drops in. So this story really just points to something much further upstream, I think.
Totally. Yeah, I think you're right. There's more than one contributing factor to the loss of trust and authority. I assume part of it is we generally have a cultural attitude that doesn't like to be told what to do. And then the other half of it is the people who have been in the past trusted institutions have legitimately done things to lose that trust. And so that's kind of a lethal combination. Then suddenly you have a culture that's not ready to listen to anybody or decides who to listen to based on factors that have nothing to do with the actual information.
Those are two factors. There's more, though. And even those two factors, I think, are worth looking at. And in other words, you need to see kind of how many things have added up to this. The first is the dramatic cultural shift from an industrial world to an information-based world. We're still reckoning with what that means. This is not something that goes very far back in human history. The internet's not that old, but what the internet did and then what smartphones did to usher the internet in every single person's hands, so that in many nations around the world, you have more smartphones than you do homes. More people have a smartphone than live in a house. You have a million different sources of information coming at you all the time. So there is a scale at which we have to reckon with information that no generation has ever had to deal with ever. You also have the tension that always exists between, freedom and control. And if you don't exert control over something as unwieldy as the internet, then you have false information, not only being available, but being served up on a daily basis on a million different topics. You have the clickbaity sort of thing, then that becomes a thing where basically the goal is to have eyeballs, whether or not the information is true. And so you add all that together. Then you have big tech figuring out ways to monetize this and big information. And, now you have the intentional creation of echo chambers serving you the information they know you will want, again, whether or not that it is true. In light of all that, you have not just, a couple institutions failing you. Go around all the institutions in society and ask, which ones haven't dramatically failed over the last couple years? If you, there's different ways to do this. People talk about the 7 mountains of society or the 7 spheres of society, or, that's one way to do it. Or you could just kind of, talk in more specific terms. But you talk about the state, you talk about the school, you talk about the church. So you talk about the state, right? That's always has a trust problem. But then you add to that the church. I mean, the church was a highly respected institution up until recent decades. And it's gone from being, if you belong to the church, you need a crutch, to if you belong to the church, you're part of a hate group. You add to that the systemic failure of schools. I mean, we've talked about this a lot, where alternative schooling is packed and overflowing. And it's not because their marketing campaign suddenly got better. It's because that there was an exposure of the failure of public education. Of course, people have been pointing to this for a long time, but what happened in the last 2 years was pretty astounding. You talk about the justice system. You talk about, even protest organizations. And what we mean by protests are the people that are, resisting trust of institutions. We have some of the major organizations like Black Lives Matter, and it's been exposed how much money those folks make. So even that group, which is supposed to reveal the fact that you can't trust, has proven untrustworthy. Then, of course, you add now in recent years the medical professions and pharmaceutical industries. And this isn't just having to do with COVID or the vaccine. You're talking about opioids and the intentional prescribing of opiates and how that's created a crisis. And so there's a trust issue there. I mean, in other words, it's not just one thing, it's everything. And in a context where it's everything, it gets, really, really hard to trust. And when there's so much information bombarding you, it's hard to even know where to begin, right? I mean, how do I even start making sense of this? How do you tell the difference between a legitimate source and an illegitimate source? The scale of which is something I think has kind of reached a crescendo that has created a need for us really to go back and go, okay, how do I even start this? How do I even approach what this task is to be discerning in a culture like ours?
It's funny. I think our culture's best answer right now in terms of that question, how do I know what to trust, is somebody standing up and saying, I'll tell you, which is kind of a parody of itself. I'm thinking about this. There are companies, contractors that work for sites like Facebook and Twitter that are quote unquote fact-checking companies. That's what they do. And I was reading a report this week by another journalist about how these companies work and that sort of thing. And, they use the term misinformation on a lot of content. And this journalist was interviewing someone at one of Facebook's fact-checking companies about what's your criteria for this. And they have different boxes they check, like false data, false whatever. And one of them is missing context. A lot of time they'll flag content and they'll just say it's missing context. And he drilled down into one story in particular and said it was a story about how the data was collected in the clinical trials for the vaccine. It had nothing to do with the actual vaccine efficacy or safety. It was just how the data was collected. And it was flagged for misinformation by this company. And the company said, well, we flagged it for missing context because we were worried it would make people not trust the vaccine. And he was asking him, going down the line of questions, like, was this claim false? Was this claim false? No, there was no falsehood in the story. They just worried that the overall impression would be to encourage people to not get the vaccine. And we're using the word misinformation to label something like that, which is fascinating and really, really worrisome, because all you're doing is answering the questions that you're bringing up about who do we trust, how do we know who to trust, by saying, this guy will tell you. And that's just another person you might not be able to trust.
Yeah, it reminds me of another story, and I'm hesitant to bring this up, having just heard from someone that they met a TSA agent at Dulles Airport who listens to the BreakPoint podcast, which is really, really great.
So sorry to that one guy, but
no, not at all. There's a story that I uncovered years ago and kind of looking at a situation with my daughter, and some of our listeners will know about that because we've talked about it in the past, and how TSA searches minors. And there was a video that went viral of I think it was at DFW, a TSA agent searching an underage boy, probably 12. It should have been 12 because that's the cutoff in terms of the policy. But doing a pat down of a 12-year-old boy in shorts and a T-shirt, no socks, that went on for 2 full minutes. It was a stunningly long pat down. So I'm looking at this and kind of saying, okay, what was the legal ramifications? What lines did this cross? When you talk about how long it should take to do a pat down, that this took 2 minutes. And I was led to a website, which is the TSA fact-checking themselves. And it specifically addressed the video. In the video, they asked the question, was this an inappropriate pat down? And their answer was no, because TSA policy says this. So the justification of the policy was the policy. It didn't refer to, anything beyond the policy. It's this self-referential thing. Yeah. And that's, I think, a problem. That just is a problem that goes, way beyond that. A couple years back, right before COVID, I was speaking to a group of grandparents and talking about the information age and the distrust that's created there, and how if they're talking to their grandkids, this is one of the existential questions that rises to the surface in our cultural moment, just because of information. Who can I trust? Who can I trust? And one of the grandparents on the front row said, look, the problem with information is not just the younger generation, it's us. Because we're just as likely to have a post come across our Facebook pages that, basically where the headline is something that reinforces a belief that we have, particularly about a political figure, and we'll hit forward without fact checking the piece, maybe not even reading the piece, and just send it forward. And in other words, we are really guilty of this. Without doing the due diligence that information requires. And that's an important point, is that information matters because information contains ideas. Ideas matter because they have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. So there's a level of care that ideas need to be handled with, kind of like if you're handling radioactive material or something like that. You have to care for it. You have to actually handle it with a level of respect, or it gets you. And I think that's where we're at, because we've treated information far too callously, far too casually, and this stuff really matters. And now we're in this mix where, again, I think in certain cultural moments, certain existential questions rise to the surface. And, a time of natural disaster, the question will be, where is God, or why do bad things happen? In a culture like ours, it's who do I trust and how can I know? There's a crisis of epistemology. 20 years ago, we'd be having this conversation about postmodernism and postmodernism skepticism of truth at all. And a lot of Christians responded, even Christian thinkers responded by hammering away at postmodernism. And postmodernism needed to be directly critiqued because it had very dangerous ideas. Postmodern thinkers offered very dangerous ideas. But it's also worth mentioning that the reason that postmodern thinkers were cynical about truth claims is that truth claims had been used the generations before at the end of the modern period, particularly when we look at the 20th century escalating to world violence and nation-state conflict at a global scale. And the claims of truth were used as weapons of violence. And the so-called neutrality of science was exposed to be false because people come at this with biases. Now, of course, postmoderns then turned around and said, you can't escape bias and there's no truth you can ever get to. That's a problematic idea. But they were responding to humanism. They were responding to Marxism. They were responding to these kind of global systems, Christendom and other things, where, a lot of times these claims to truth were used in inappropriate ways.
So I want to ask you a question about this. I'm thinking if we needed to, we could take a break here and come back. But I want to ask you a question about this crisis of epistemology, but also the crisis of earning the trust that's needed in order for all these institutions, you're talking about the 7 mountains or spheres, for those to function. For a society to function well, you have to have some sort of trust in institutions or expertise or that sort of thing. I hear a little nagging voice in my head saying that this is a criticism, and a worthwhile criticism, of capitalism generally, where you could say that quote from John Adams that says the Constitution is meant for a moral and religious people, and anybody except that is not able to govern themselves under this sort of liberty. And I wonder if the same thing applies to capitalism, that it works when there are certain common virtues that are respected. There are certain like social contracts that can't be broken. The problem is I can't envision any sort of alternative that's any better, even when all this trust is lost. Because at the end of the day, the only alternative to a free market society is a market that's owned by a person who has human nature and all of the same fallibilities as everybody else. But are these failures that we're talking about now in trust and authority? Could even something like you were talking about the opioid crisis, you can see that as a failure of capitalism, or the fact that, Spotify is motivated by money, understandably, but that these tech companies are making decisions probably with profit first in mind, whether it's about misinformation or anything else, that the capitalism has created the system in which these sorts of things can happen. But is that a valid critique? Is there something better when we've reached this level of degradation culturally? Is there a better system?
Well, I think we have to have an accurate view of the world. And when you don't have an accurate view of the world, the best intentions go wrong. I don't think Marx was this evil guy. I think his ideas were, he was fallen like the rest of us. He was a fallen thinker. His ideas of utopia and the possibility, inevitability of utopia were exactly wrong. In other words, good intentions completely missed the human condition. Mm-hmm. Attempting to engineer the world based on a set of categories about how the world works that were just flat out wrong. A system, for example, that elevates itself over the significance of the individual is one that's always going to fail, because at the end of the day, you always have people. And so Marxist well-intended bad ideas get in the hands of people who have, illusions of power and, lose touch with reality, think that the individuals in the masses can be sacrificed for the good of the quote-unquote people, forgetting that people are made up of individuals as well, and millions of people die. Not a few, millions of people are slaughtered. And an accurate critique of it then requires a dead-on view of human nature and the way the world works. Capitalism is the same thing. Not the same thing, because there's kind of built in to the system a way of kind of competing desires, kind of keeping things in checks and balances. But it functions well when you do have virtuous people, and non-virtuous people can figure out ways to cheat any system and can cheat this system as well. And fallen people can just make mistakes. And you put all of that together, you have to have a real view of the world. Anybody who then has capitalism as the way to bring in a utopia is making the same mistake that Marxists did. There's not a utopian future in our future. There's not a utopian possibility in our future. It just doesn't exist. And, there's that line, I think it's been attributed to Churchill and probably 7 or more other people, was asked about a particular view of democracy or something like that. And he goes, yeah, it's the worst except for all the others. In other words, there's some built-in ways that it has checks and balances. And if those checks and balances are overlooked, and capitalism is not the problem, crony capitalism is. If crony capitalism is not actively prevented and capitalism is allowed to run outside of any sort of checks and balances, there's not it's even the case of religious liberty. Religious liberty is a good, but if you don't take into account fallen human nature and the capacity of humans to have religious beliefs that are wrong, even dangerous, then all of a sudden religious liberty with no limits becomes religious coercion and oppression. There has to be a down-to-earth view of the sort of creatures that we are. And so, I think, you can approach truth outside of a Christian worldview, but you don't get there without a Christian worldview. And, that's historically the brilliance. I was having this conversation last night about there's a new set of academic programming and thinkers kind of looking back to Hebraic thought, kind of Jewish view of life in the world that you see really put together in the Old Testament. And there's a contribution that it made to all kinds of different parts of human history afterwards because of a different way of seeing who humans are. And it's a pretty profound thing that's been underexplored. And so there's now some academic pushes to explore that. And I think it's really important. It's important for Christians because our understanding of the human person is grounded in that way of seeing life in the world as well. So in other words, you don't solve the problem by taking one theory of everything and then imposing another theory of everything. It might be a better than bad theory of everything, but a theory of everything it never works.
So it's not necessarily the system itself, it's what you're expecting from it.
All these systems are human creations. All these systems are human attempts to put things together. And it's interesting you say, will capitalism work? Well, work for who? Even this dreadful, guilt that the pharmaceutical industry has, they're not alone in their guilt. I mean, people made decisions, doctors made decisions, the state made decisions, FDA made decisions. And it did work for a while for some people and didn't work for others. I mean, so there's something that system taps into that leads to prosperity for some. But what does it look like for that rising tide to lift all ships? It's not an uncritiquable or uncorrectable system. It's not a hands-off, at all costs. You have to have virtuous citizens. You have to have institutions. And, to go back to our conversation about institutional trust, there are fundamental institutions to a society. The one that I didn't mention, of course, that has proven untrustworthy as well is the family. The family is where you learn trust, right? When your mom says, clean your room, and you're like, yep, as soon as this show is over, I'll go clean my room. And then you find out whether you're trustworthy. And then you learn how to be trustworthy if you don't do it. And if you don't have that family unit where you learn trust, or where within a family, you're catechized in a sense to not trust anything or anyone, and because you find things untrustworthy, then, the crisis of authority only gets worse and worse and worse.
Which is so fascinating, because if that trust relationship is severed, I mean, that's considered like a psychological disability when it gets to a certain level. If kids don't learn trust by a certain age, you can't overcome that. I have a good friend of mine who's adopted a child who has a lot of issues, and it's fascinating to see. I mean, it's really heartbreaking, but I think that's just true of our human condition, that we require that. But I think that's really cool about studying the Hebraic way of life. Just last night in my small group, we were talking about Sabbath and what it's made for and how it corresponds to the creation story in Genesis. And we were talking about, I think we sometimes approach Sabbath as if this is God telling us, like, you need a minute. Like, put your feet up, your body needs rest and that sort of thing. And I think this is certainly true that he knows about us, that we require rest. I mean, we sleep every night, he's made us that way. But I think if you look at the origins of the Sabbath in the Genesis story, but also in Exodus when he gives that law to the Israelites, it's less of a, you deserve a rest, and more of a, I know this about you, that you're going to need a periodic and regular reminder that I am your provider. And it makes me think of the story of, God sending manna and quail every day, and they're not supposed to gather it for more than a day, except on Saturdays or, Fridays. They gather enough for 2 days so that they don't have to gather it on the Sabbath, and how seriously he takes that when people violate that command. They're smote, just straight up smote. But it's meant to communicate that this is your reminder that I am providing these things for you. And I think that gets back to our discussion of authority, like the ultimate authority in our economic system, in science and technology, just in the way the world is and our understanding of the world and how we should move around in it. Our ultimate authority has to be the Lord, because he's the one who made it. And it's just fascinating the way that he mandated that through the Israelites. You wouldn't think of that being a manner of teaching, that rest would be a way to send a message or to teach a lesson like that, but it is. That's what he used.
That's a really important jumping off point to kind of where we can go from here, because when we talk about a crisis of authority and a loss of trust, then where that's left us, and I think, again, there's all kinds of contributing factors. We didn't get here in a vacuum, but all these contributing factors have left a country that is basically where there's a lot of people that are anarchists in practice. In other words, all I need to know is you tell me what to do and I will question your authority. The answer is not to go back or retreat to blind trust because, again, so many sources of authority have proven themselves to be untrustworthy. But we have to, I think, especially as followers of Jesus, because there is such a thing as authority in the world. There is a God who has ultimate authority, and that God has ordained authorities in our lives. Like it or not, and I trust me, I don't like it, but God has ordained authorities. Somehow we have got to get to a point where we can be discerning and without being cynical. In other words, the cynicism of any authority that defines our age is not healthy or sustainable. It's not obedient to the Lord. So how do we actually get to a point where we can be properly discerning? And part of this is being able to make distinctions. We did a commentary on this week, and it sparked some comments. I was reading through them on our Facebook page, and I get it. I get the cynicism. I get the distrust. But, pointing to a story like, for example, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who chose to disobey Nebuchadnezzar, and equating that to some of the modern day struggles we have today, where, we don't have anybody putting a gun to our head saying bow to an emperor, but, right. Whether I should wear a mask in a building or something, that shows me that we've retreated into cynicism. We're not thinking well. To apply what our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who are being forced to choose between their faith and their lives with the struggles that some of us are equating it to just doesn't make sense. I'm not talking, of course, about other decisions where you actually have to choose whether I'm going to obey God or obey the state. By the way, one aspect of this is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did choose to disobey, and they respected the authority of Nebuchadnezzar and the penalty for disobeying.
They accepted the consequences, totally.
They really did.
And not only that, but they said, the Lord will protect us, and even if he doesn't. It wasn't like we know that, we're above this and he's going to save us no matter what because we're doing the right thing. They respected, they lived within the system they were in.
We have to admit that there's a difference. And I'm not saying that there's no areas right now that we shouldn't obey the state, for example, or other authorities. I think there are. I mean, obviously we have talked about this on the religious liberty issues and with our friends Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman. We think what they did is so noble and important culturally that, they're the recipients of this year's Wilberforce Award. First time we've ever given a joint award at our Wilberforce weekend event coming up in May, which everyone should sign up for. But that's an amazing an example. I also look at how they did it. There's not this kind of irate vitriol coming out of either one of their mouths in the midst of this. And they have continued the appeal. I think another distinction we have to make is the distinction between living in a place where there's an emperor, one man says it and it goes, and living in a place where the system actually sets us up as self-governed. And, in other words, we're the king. It goes back to that line from The Patriot where Mel Gibson says, why would I trade one king 1,000 miles away for 1,000 king 1 mile away? And like it or not, that's the deal we made in the United States. We're all kings. And so basically stepping up to self-govern and to self-govern together. We have tons of things to appeal to that our brothers and sisters in other situations don't. We're jumping past so much sometimes and kind of a vitriol about authority. And it's not a way to go forward, and it's not beginning at the right place. So that's why we put together this short course. That's why we're starting the short course where we have to start, which is there is such a thing as authority. It's rooted in the authority of God, and God has chosen to ordain authority. So, we can't question that. Let's make sure we get that down. And then let's take a hard look at how the institutions around us, some of them ordained authorities and some of them self-ordained authorities, even illegitimately, have failed us. Let's talk about it. Let's look at it so that we're not foolish. And then let's look at what it means to be discerning without being cynical. And then let's take a hard look at institutions, because institutions are too important in a social fabric. And institutions, as we've said, across the board have proven themselves untrustworthy. So we got two choices. We abandon the institutions or we try to restore the institutions. And I think a Christian worldview pushes us in a restorative way. Sometimes restoration can look like building alternatives. That's why, we're putting so much energy and effort right now into Christian education, because I'm not trying to restore that form of education. I'm trying to restore education. And there are wonderful alternatives right now. And let's let 1,000 flowers bloom and see what we can't do. Because it's not like we can stop teaching our kids. It's not like we can just throw our hands up and give up on all of them. And if we think that just because there is an alternative, if we don't invest, that it's not going to degrade, that's kind of like saying, well, sure, the answer to communism is capitalism, rather than the answer to communism is virtuous citizenry with freedom. Those are two different ways of seeing that. So anyway, that's why we're doing this short course. I think it's going to be outstanding. I mean, Bruce Ashford has done some remarkable work on this. He'll be leading the first 3 weeks. And Yuval Levin is a Jewish scholar and thinker who is coming from that kind of Hebraic way of seeing things. And his work on institutions is really stellar. And so he's somebody that I think Christians can really learn from within that larger context of really making sure we understand the authority of God in Christ Jesus specifically. God has given all authority to Christ. And we've got to begin there and then hopefully be able to think well about not only our personal lives and how we're responding in our own anger or our own confusion, but also what it means to live life together and how Christians can be part of the solution, not the problem.
Totally. Yeah, I'm really excited about that. Well, John, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more BreakPoint this week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Stick around.
We're at a crossroad in our view of trust and authority in America. And while the issue is not new, it's certainly spread recently. Doctors used to be trusted more than they are now, with the fault lines unearthed on COVID treatment and practices. The military used to be trusted more than they are now, but some struggle to have faith in what's being seen as a woke agenda emerging in many branches. Even private companies are trusted less and less as they bow to new agendas and ideologies to stay in line with culture. We've seen this all play out in schools, churches, and in the media. The Colson Center is offering a 4-part short course on the loss of trust and our crisis of authority, a Christian response. To register, visit colsoncenter.org/events.
We're back on BreakPoint this week. I'm Maria Bear alongside John Stonestreet. John, I want to turn now to some of the stories that we shared this week at breakpoint.org, some of the other commentaries that you can also hear on the BreakPoint podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. One of them I loved, and it ran this morning. So we're recording this on Friday morning. This was about technology, and the title was God is no Luddite, and we need not be either. And I have to confess, I didn't know what a Luddite was until recently, but this is a term for people who opposed industrialization, were either afraid of or mistrusting of new technology, and would sometimes destroy it by violent means because they were worried it would disrupt or ruin a peaceful way of life. And so the idea is, if you're a Luddite in today's context, that you oppose new technology or you're mistrusting of it. And I think you struck a really cool line here in this commentary where there is reason to think about technology. We never want to just accept advances unquestioningly or think that because we can do something, that means we should do something. At the same time, the Bible gives clear precedent for the ingenuity and cleverness and invention, the inventing spirit of mankind that is given by God, and that can be a great blessing. I loved that example in the commentary you shared, that the story of creation started in a garden, and in the book of Revelation, it says that the kingdom will be ushered in a city, which is a sociological and technological innovation, which means that is something blessed by God as well. There's a lot here. So walk me through what you guys were thinking when you wrote this. I believe you wrote this alongside my colleague Casey. Is that right?
Yeah, this Casey found this really interesting anecdote where 25 years ago there was a wager that was made. And if you can think about 20, 25 years ago, the internet's just about to change things, right? And there was somebody who could legitimately be called a Luddite. He was a fan of the Luddites. And Luddites aren't just uncomfortable with technology. They actively oppose it because they see, and sometimes rightly, the potential damage that would come. I mean, you talk about the Luddites in Britain in the Industrial Revolution, some of the things that they were worried about happened. People lost their jobs. People lost their livelihoods. It's not like there's only two options between being a Luddite and being a utopianist when it comes to technology. In fact, that's the problem. But the wager was made between someone who was opposed to digital technology in kind of all forms, predicting that it was going to end the world. I mean, it was going to end society as we know it. It was going to cause mass starvation. It was going to cause huge economic problems, wars between wealthy and impoverished nations, and everything else. And in fact, what's happened is that the internet didn't ruin the world. Now, it's brought a whole lot of bad things into the world. Many of us look at it and go, if I never get online again, it'll be good. But it's also made, for example, financial transactions possible in nations where you can kind of guarantee security and trust, places that was never a possibility before because they lack the institutional infrastructure. It's also saved all of us a lot of money on car repairs because we realized that little electronic quirk that is making our windows not roll up and down after changing a battery is actually not something that we need to go to the mechanic to fix, but there's a gimmick and you can find the YouTube video.
I was going to say, I thought you were going to say you can just look it up on YouTube and do it yourself.
No, it is. The YouTube videos have saved. I mean, you can almost type in any problem you're having and it goes exactly to tell you what's happened. Not to mention home repairs, how to replace a faucet on the outside of your house. I mean, these are just
how to do your makeup, John.
Well, I was going with personal stories, not yours. But yeah, there's just how to tie a Windsor knot in a tie. There's all kinds of ways that you can save time and money. But the bet was with one of the founding editors of Wired magazine, and it was for $1,000, and 20 years later was 2020. And ironically, of course, this bet came to age in a year of a pandemic, but still it was clear who had won the bet. And I think this is one of the reasons we always try at the Colson Center to go upstream, 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 upstream. Because if you don't, you end up reacting to the cultural moment without having the right categories of thought and the right categories of perspective. So just like in the last conversation we were having, listen, when all authority is in crisis, the only way to think about this well is to back up and go, you know what? We need to understand what authority is first. Same thing here. Technology is made possible because of the way God made us. The way God made us, he called good. The problem isn't that there is technology. The problem is the direction we take technology and how do we actually guard our own hearts and minds and our societies against it. So yeah, it was a great find by Casey. He did we went back and forth on this one, but he did the lion's share of the work and really nailed something that we've got to continue, to think about as Christians today.
Yeah, that's awesome. There was one more commentary I want to talk through with you as well. This is one you and I did together. And this was about sort of, you brought this to my attention, but the evolving legal definition of the word parent. And this is something that's been an issue now for decades, but I think is just going to be increasingly more of an issue. But I wasn't aware. So there's something called the Universal Parentage Act. And the people who put this forward, I mean, it was a group of legal scholars and activists. This really started in the 70s, and they were very smart about it because this is done at the state level. So this was not a federal law, the Uniform Parentage Act, but it was some form or another was passed by all 50 states in the 70s. And this was a legal definition of the word parent. And what you and I wanted to look at is how has that definition changed over time? Because in many states, that definition has grown or expanded over time, which is not how language generally works or is supposed to work. And it was funny, as I was writing this, my husband was like, Maria, just whatever you do, please do not quote David Foster Wallace, because I'm telling him, like, Aaron, this is just a language discussion. That's what this is. It's language first. But so in the 70s, they passed this Uniform Parentage Act to codify that a parent is a biological parent of a child or someone who's gone through legal adoption. And the problem was that there were children who were not inheriting, they didn't have the legal rights to the inheritance after their father's death if their mother and father weren't married. There was still the concept of illegitimate children, and there were a lot of legal quagmires there. So they passed this to codify that if you're a child's biological parent, then the child is legally entitled to all of the rights that go with parenthood and childhood. Moving forward then into the 2000s, when assisted reproduction started getting more sophisticated, getting more common, it was updated to include people who had used assisted reproduction to become parents. Again, that's the definition expanding in that way. So somebody who was not biologically related to the child, but had gone through some process where money changed hands and papers were signed. And now they had adopted, I would say, a baby through a surrogate mother or sperm donation or whatever, can be considered that child's parent. Well, now in 2017, more updates were brought in, I think 11 states officially updated the Uniform Parentage Act, but more states are still looking at it. And the definition is still expanding. So in a lot of states now, if you are a same-sex partnership and one of the people in the relationship has a biological child, the spouse of the person whose biological child it is, who has no biological relation to the child, can be considered a legal parent. And that really opens the door to a lot more legal questions. And the interesting part of this here, which you and I talked about in this commentary as well, was the way Obergefell, that decision really informed this changing definition of parent. Because in that decision and in the lead up to the decision, most activists and even judges said, same-sex marriage has nothing to do with children. We're not talking about children here. We're talking about consenting adults. As soon as Obergefell happened, the legal scholars were explicit about it. Like, now that this decision has come down, we have to redefine parent. Otherwise, it's discriminatory, according to Obergefell. So the point that you and I wanted to make, I think, is that when you redefine the word parent, the people with the most to gain or the most to lose are the children, and they're not consulted here. And that is a problem. That's a space for the church to fill at this point.
So, you kind of pointed to the fundamental issue at work. The original Universal Parentage Act was about the rights of children, to be able to claim who their moms and dads are, being illegitimate, as the word used to be, which of course is a word that we don't use anymore. And I think is a word that, and when applied to children, needs to absolutely be thrown into the dustbin of history, but meant that you basically had no rights. No choice of your own. You were brought into a situation and then you're kind of penalized by society at the same time. So this was an attempt really to recognize the rights of the child. And then adoption, bringing that in, was a way, again, something about the rights of the child, the right of a child to be in a home, to be in a family. It's the exact opposite with these innovations to the Universal Parentage Act. The innovation, for example, including same-sex domestic partners. And you might remember this, but I remember the case was in the state of Virginia, and it went all the way back to when I was living in Virginia. So we're talking about, I think I was in high school, maybe college. I have to go back and see how long ago it exactly was, with a lesbian partner of someone who had a child. They were in Vermont, which I believed at the time recognized, domestic partnerships, civil unions, essentially, basically claimed parenting rights over a child that she had no biological relation to, only had a relationship with because she was in a sexual relationship and a domestic relationship with the child's mom. And the mom had left with the child, having actually become a Christian and wanting to leave that lifestyle, moved to Virginia and lost custody. Yeah. So she basically picked up and smuggled the child outside of the country. And it was just, 3 or 4 years ago, now that the child is 18, where they came back and she faced legal struggle. This was an example, by the way, of choosing to obey God instead of the state, and then coming back and saying, okay, I'll have the penalty now. And I don't know where that case is. We talked about it when that story came, that they come back on the scene. But that's an example. Now think about how different that is, because the original Universal Parentage Act was about the rights of the child. This revision, this innovation, which of course was in this case and then translated into reframing the Universal Parentage Act, is not about the rights of the child anymore. It's about the rights of the adult. Yeah. When you go beyond that to artificial reproductive technologies, the biological relationship between the parent and the child is cut off, and rights are given to those who don't have a biological relationship to the child, whether we're talking about through in vitro or sperm donation, surrogacy, or something else. So this whole thing has been flipped on its head, and it's been flipped and redefined. First, it's been flipped because what used to be about the rights of the child to correct a historic injustice has become about the rights of the adult, not even the parent, the rights of the adult to claim children as a right. And it also then fundamentally at every time we do this, introduce parties into this language of parenting that don't have that biological relationship and aren't taking on the care in that same adoptive way. There's a difference, and let me just be really clear on this. There's a difference between caring for a child who has been subjected to a family situation outside of their own choice, like in other words, a parent has died or has been left abandoned or something like that, and an adoptive parent steps in. That's different than basically by adopting, making an orphan. In other words, by an artificial act of reproduction or something like that, making an orphan up front and then claiming it. Claiming the child as the right is really the whole problem. And that also severs the inherent link between sex, marriage, and babies. And again, that link is not something we've made up. It's not a speed limit. It's gravity. It actually exists in real life. And because it exists in real life, our legislative attempts to sever that inherent connection is something that always then leaves the child at the whims of adult happiness. So it's all about adult rights. It's not about child rights. It's all about children being claimed as a right, not children being something that adults are responsible for. And it's a travesty. And language matters, specifically when language has the force of the law behind it.
Yeah. In other areas of the law, we look at this differently, which makes this so interesting. I remember a case a couple of years ago in which a family had fostered a little girl for several years and was hoping to adopt. And then ultimately the state found that the little girl had relatives and the little girl was Native American. And we have very specific laws, most states do, governing adoption of Native American children. And the child ultimately was taken from the would-be adoptive family and given to sort of distant relatives within the Native American community. And I don't mean to say that that was right or wrong. I mean, it was really tragic in a lot of directions. There's a lot of heartbreak there for several reasons. But it is interesting that in that area of law, at least, we're thinking about like that the child who is being fostered has relatives. Like there's another person. I think about this every time with assisted reproduction. A child of surrogacy or a child of sperm donation has a father or a mother out there somewhere else that's not a part of this legal definition anymore. A child doesn't get created out of thin air because that's how you would have hoped it could have happened. The mechanics of creating a child remain the same. So every child with two married same-sex moms has a father. That has to be literally true. And it's just interesting that in different areas of the law, we look at it differently because what it betrays, I think, is the pressure of the LGBTQ lobby. Because when we err on the side of giving parents what they want, it's usually in service to that situation, or at least it starts there. Assisted reproduction is a little bit different, but I just find that really interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. I mean, I know I've got friends, and I'm thinking of a couple names who went through a similar situation on a personal level, providing foster care, which is really such a redemptive thing that families can do, and wanting to adopt, and then the biological mother, is back into the picture, maybe has had a lot of trouble. And it's a hard thing because the law in that case does err towards keeping the biological connection intact. That's the way the law is set up. I don't think that's a mistake. I think that's actually the right leaning, but it's a really hard thing to know, when change has really happened, when a child is actually going to get a stable situation, what that means. It's a devastating sort of thing. So you have situations where, a child from the hospital has been in care for 2-3 years and then ends up going back to a biological parent. That is a heartbreaking and a hard thing on all sides. But it's coming because the brokenness is already there and people trying to solve the brokenness. And the question is always, what's in the best interest of the child? What's in the best interest of the child? And there's an initial slant that biological connections are in the best interest of the child. That obviously is not always true in a situation where there's already brokenness. Our point here is that the way these universal parentage acts have been redefined is that the brokenness is being created because of adults seeking their own happiness. That's the problem. It's exactly backwards.
I think, too, just real quickly, I see this issue playing out in other areas of culture as well, in which adults look at children not so much as a blessing or something that they're charged with taking care of, although that might be part of it. But there is a tendency now to look at children as like status symbols or ornaments. Maybe that's existed for a longer time than I've realized, but I feel like social media has played a big role in this. I think in the mommy blogging world, there's something just doesn't sit right with me a lot of times. I'm going to sound like a curmudgeon and like I'm passing judgment on people, and I don't mean to. But whenever, you see pictures of like kids who are clearly staged in the picture or who are always wearing matching outfits, or there's some kind of culture here in the West, at least, where children have become a sort of status symbol or adornment on a life. You see it in sitcoms too, where it's like the next chapter of my life is I want a baby because that's what you should do. And I think that's all part of the same nugget of sin at it, which is looking at children as objects and not as other full, valuable human beings. And I think we're all guilty to something like that to some degree.
There's so much that can be solved when people are seen as subjects, not as objects. And that's a framework that I am grateful for from a friend of mine who from the Acton Institute who applied that to poverty. When poverty becomes basically seeing others as objects of our pity as opposed to subjects in their own story. And that's what's happened with children. These are objects. They're objects of our affection as opposed to subjects. They're objects of our of inconvenience rather than subjects. And, you talk about, since we had the conversation about economics and capitalism earlier, this is what happens when people are seen as objects of exchange rather than subjects. That is where capitalism becomes damaging and painful and, inflicting harm rather than good.
We talk about this a lot with the abortion discussion because a lot of the pro-choice rhetoric around abortion is about children being burdens. And the same sin, the same evil that's at root there can be used on the absolute opposite side of the spectrum as well. Like within assisted reproduction, for example, I have a right to a child with my biology, even though I'm not in a situation that can naturally create that. That commits the same error. It just looks different. It feels a little more tenable because it's a positive desire for children as opposed to negative, but it's the same.
Yeah, and on a more immediate basis, you brought up something just quickly that I want to go back and rehash, because if you go back to Obergefell and how same-sex marriage was sold, it was sold on equating same-sex love with heterosexual love. And that implies two things. Number one is that heterosexual love and same-sex love are purely emotional and don't involve bodies. Because even if you don't think it's immoral, to say that it's the same only makes sense if the only aspect of romantic or marital love is how strongly we feel and how committed we'll be to one another and all of that. It's as if we're not two bodies coming together. And that's, of course, why the state has always cared about marriage anyway, is about the procreative potential. My friend Frank Turek would say it this way, if every single person lived in a loving, committed, monogamous, heterosexual relationship, the world has a future. If every single person lives in a loving, committed, monogamous, homosexual relationship, the world doesn't have a future. That's not speaking about the morality of it. That's just speaking about the mechanics of it. And as we put it in the commentary, you might think that the mechanics are bigoted and discriminatory. The mechanics are what the mechanics are, That's not something that can change. So once you assume that bodies have nothing to do with it, then you say love is love. And so there was never a discussion about the children, the procreative aspects of it. When some of us brought up the procreative aspects and the differences there and the reason that the state cared about marriage to begin with. So, for example, you can go back through history and, you can go into our legal documents like marriage licenses. The state never shows any interest into the sincerity of a couple's love.
Right.
It never asks. You go get a marriage license and they're never like, here's Cosmo Magazine's 6 tips to know if you're in love. Take the quiz, and if you pass, I'll give you a marriage license. It's always like, hey, are you guys related? And are you already married to someone else? I mean, the questions you ask have to do with the institution of the family and the possibility and the reality of children. It was only on this. This is the only conversation we've had about marriage as a society and legally that did not take those folks into account. And yet, here you have an institution that was sold on romantic love, not procreation. We were told it has nothing to do with it. And, immediately after granting that category, expanding marriage, so-called, which in fact redefined it, but immediately after that, you have those who demanded that intentionally, biologically sterile unions then have the right to have children. And it goes to this idea of redefining not just our words or clarifying our meanings, but redefining reality itself. It's not discriminatory or bigoted or hateful that 2 men and 2 women are not procreative. They're just not. They can't have children. It's just that's like saying gravity is discriminatory. This is the way the world works. You don't even have to think that it was created or that there's a moral aspect of that to get to that conclusion. But that's really what's happening. And our technology, to go to our last conversation on technology, then is being hijacked and used in order to alter those categories of reality itself in service of adult happiness, with kids' rights being completely dismissed.
Yeah. And all of that given that we know that kids with a mom and a dad in the home together do the best on every metric measurable. And that's part of this conversation too. All right, John. Well, let's talk now about recommendations. Let's set aside the worldview. I feel like whenever it's my turn, you probably get very nervous. It's like Russian roulette with my recommendations. I've had some before that you have expressly not liked.
Oh, completely. Yeah. I'll admit that. I'm not hiding that. I mean, look, if you watch the video version of this podcast, you'll see it on my face. It reminds me. One time I had a PhD creation scientist, the smartest guy I've ever personally met, who we taught at the same school. And this guy was really interesting, fascinating guy. Love him. And he had I just really appreciate his contribution to my life and formation. But he was my second year teaching at a college level, and he told me he was going to take my class. I'm not kidding. He took my class.
Oh,
and he's in the back of the room, and he's very, very expressive guy. He's in the back of the room, and I would say something, and he'd be like, and if you can't see this, shaking his head back and forth, smacking his forehead, groaning out loud in the middle of the class. I promise he did that. It was really an interesting. I had to come to terms with it really, really quick. And then we did peer-to-peer evaluations that semester at this school. And so he said, I've been taking your class, I'll do yours. And he wrote this scathing review and he put a copy of it on my desk. And I read through it and I'm like, and it just was brutal top to bottom. And then I look at the date and it was April the 1st.
Oh my gosh.
It was April Fool's Day. It took me like 15 minutes. Yeah. And so I went down, and as soon as I walked into his office, he had this really loud cackly laugh, and you always knew if he was in the room. And as soon as I walked in, he just starts laughing, ha 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 ha, and then he handed me the real one, and it was a very kind evaluation. I took the fake one home to Sarah. We probably only been married like 2 years at that point. And I took it home to her, and I just gave it to her, and she started to cry. She started to cry. It was so brutal. Yeah, it was so funny.
Oh my gosh!
Why did I talk about that?
That's mean and sweet. I don't know, but you really took me for a ride there.
Did you like that? Really, but here's why. Because sometimes when you make recommendations, I channel my inner Dr. Wise, and I'm smacking my forehead and shaking my head and
you know what I
groaning
think
out
the
loud.
problem is? Here's my diagnosis.
You don't think the problem's with your
Aaron,
recommendations?
Definitely not. Absolutely not. Don't be ridiculous.
Okay.
You and
That's
Aaron
where I think the problem is.
My husband are very similar, where like so smart, very intellectually curious, like open-minded when it comes to hearing any and all ideas. And then there's some level of art where you're just like, not interested. No, I don't care. I just don't care. I'll describe a movie to my husband and be like, this changed my life. And here's all the ways it did and here's what it meant to me. Do you want to watch it? And he's like, no, absolutely not. I have no intention of ever watching that. And I don't get it, but that's just the way you are. However, I am confident that you will not object to my recommendation today, because I thought of it right after we recorded last week's podcast, actually. We were talking about Holocaust Remembrance Day and what it means to remember and teach our kids about what sort of world we live in. And we do that by teaching them what's possible and what has happened and what we've done to each other, and as hard as that can be. So Sarah Groves, I'm bringing her up again. I've brought her up so many times before, but she's a Christian musician. I honestly think of her as a philosopher. She just really is. And she came out with a new album earlier this year. And it's beautiful. It's called What Makes It Through. So that's going to be my recommendation. But the last song on the album is called Reach Inside. And I'm just going to read the beginning of the lyrics. We were born after the last great war. We came around after some big regrets. We have no way to download the brutal scars or to try to tell a newborn baby, don't forget. And the whole song is just about exactly what we were talking about. How do you download the heaviness of what has gone before you, to try and protect against that chronological snobbery we always talk about, to try and teach kids that your nature isn't any different than the people who came before you. It's a beautiful song. She's the queen of vibes. Like, every song has such a great atmosphere and catchy. There's even a song in there about the Cheshire Cat. John, she's a philosopher. I'm surprised you don't like her as much as me. I'm still going to try, even though you hate everything I recommend to you. I'm still trying to make you like one thing.
I do not say I hate everything I recommend, but you've had some doozies.
Whatever. You just don't appreciate art.
And I just love the fact that the problem is clearly my taste in art, not your recommendations.
Ridiculous. I can't be convinced otherwise.
All right, my recommendation is to take a moment and seriously consider the implications of the Winter Olympics and the coverage of the Winter Olympics and our participation in the Winter Olympics. It's a hard one. I struggle with this because I'm not always a fan of boycotts. I'm a fan of boycotts less as a strategy and more as a conscience. I can't participate in this. At the same time, the Olympics involves, people who are not guilty of, any sort of kind of grand genocide like the nation of China is. Having worked for this, and this is their shot. I think the cosmetic way that the United States has responded is poor. We won't send a diplomatic delegation as if, oh, great, I don't have to pay a lot of money to host your diplomats. It's cosmetic and it's poor. There are some real questions about these games. And my friend Reggie Littlejohn has probably done more than anybody else to try to rally around this. She spent her life dealing with forced abortions in China. Her Women's Rights Without Frontiers is the organization that has been advocating against this for a long time. And she's taken a very clear and strong stand and compiled a very helpful list of documents and arguments about how we should approach these Winter Olympics. And so if you're watching these with your kids, don't watch them without having this hard conversation. Take a hard look at it. Make the what's happening known. And the website that you can go to is genocidegames.org. Genocidegames.org. And it's worth taking a strong look at. And it's interesting because we're having this conversation, and our colleague just sent a tweet from NBC News saying that China has chosen a Uyghur athlete to deliver the final Olympic flame at the opening ceremony. And Jake Tapper, who is not someone most of us would agree with all the time, responds with, "It's hard to imagine a more cynical move. The Chinese government is literally committing genocide simultaneously against the Uyghurs." And then there's a whole thread to this. At Wilberforce weekend, as we were honoring Bob Fu last there in the audience, unbeknownst to us, he was just one of the guests that we were happy to accommodate from Pastor Fu, was a Uyghur couple and a Uyghur woman that had been smuggled out of China because of the wonderful work of Bob Fu. And, knowing the story behind that and what they've been subjected to. Look, to say that, we don't have any COVID cases during the Winter Olympics, to believe that is beyond credulity. To do then something like this, to put a Uyghur person to bear the final torch, simultaneously committing genocide against the Uyghur people. And I mean like systemic forced sterilizations, forced abortions, using hair for beauty products and selling them around the world, forced prostitution. You put all of this together, and China's willingness to create a theater to hide gross atrocities has not been seen in the world since Germany in World War II. So don't engage this Winter Olympic Games without some level of taking seriously what's happening. I get the tension between, penalizing all these athletes because of this nation. I get that. But take this seriously. At least have the conversation. Don't overlook it. Don't allow that theater to just go unaddressed. And I don't know what the coverage has been. I do know that news organizations, particularly NBC News, who covers the Olympics, are typically quite reticent to say anything critical about a host nation. Not to mention, obviously, American media conglomerates seem to be really hesitant to say anything critical about China anyway. Not, especially sports bodies. You've got to take this seriously. The World Tennis Association being the main exception to that. But it's something to take seriously and have a conversation with your kids and family, and maybe make the hard choice.
Okay, well, thanks, John. Thank you guys so much for being with us today. This has been another episode of BreakPoint this week from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Maria Bear alongside John Stone Street. As always, you can listen to all of the commentaries that we talked about today, as well as more, and find other resources, as well as information about our short course that we mentioned at breakpoint.org. Thanks so much for being with us. We'll see you all next week.